crisis in Iran continues to deepen. Protests are spreading with demands to remove the dictator, and the crackdown is intensifying, including an internet blackout. Imagine waking up one morning and everything is frozen. Your phone shows signal bars, but nothing loads. Messages don't send, calls don't connect, social media disappears, news websites won't open. You try to reach your friends, relatives, and coworkers, and nothing comes back. You step outside and realize it's not just you. The entire country has gone dark at the same moment. This is exactly what happened in Iran. Hello friends, I'm your friend Newsboy, and as always, let's understand everything in full detail. At 7 p.m. local time, the regime cut off mobile data, home broadband, and digital communication nationwide. This was not a technical glitch or an accident. It was a deliberate switch off, a move that history usually signals in only one way. The state is preparing to act and does not want witnesses. Iranian authorities shut down internet and phone services across the country in an attempt to curb protests that had rapidly escalated overnight. History inside Iran has taught people to fear this silence more than noise. When the internet disappears, violence often follows. This blackout is not about cables or servers. It is about isolation. It prevents families from warning one another, protesters from coordinating, and the outside world from seeing what comes next. It forces millions into a single narrative pipeline controlled by state television and official statements. In previous nationwide shutdowns, the same tactic was followed by mass arrests and lethal crackdowns. Because when cameras go dark, accountability disappears. That memory now hangs over the streets. The calm that follows the blackout is not peace. It is the pause before impact. Something unexpected is happening beneath the silence. Even though the country has been digitally sealed, footage is still leaking out. Satellite connections, illegal terminals, and improvised links are punching holes in the blackout. What emerges from those gaps is not order, but fear on the side of the state. Images show security forces repositioning, armored vehicles moving into neighborhoods, and institutions meant for daily life being converted into forward operating bases. Schools are no longer schools. They are staging grounds. Campuses are filled with motorcycles, trucks, and personnel preparing for rapid deployment. This is not how a confident government behaves. This is how a regime acts when it expects confrontation. At the same time, journalists across Iran are being summoned and pressured to sign pledges restricting their coverage of protests. Those who refuse are reportedly threatened with arrest. This is the second layer of the blackout. First, remove the internet. Second, silence professional witnesses. Third, fill the vacuum with fear and misinformation. Their hands are tied. The regime is under crippling sanctions because of its nuclear program, proxy support, and more. Citizens are also receiving direct intimidation messages on their phones, warning that membership in protest-related groups or expressing opposition views may be treated as a criminal offense. This is not law enforcement aimed at preventing violence. This is political intimidation aimed at preventing presence. A government that threatens its population by text message has already lost moral authority. It rules by warning, not consent. The timing of all this is not accidental. Earlier, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi issued a direct appeal to Iran's armed and security forces, framing their position as a historic choice between standing with the people or enforcing repression. He also called on citizens to appear in public at 8 p.m. local time on January 8th, turning a single hour into a national test. Roughly 1 hour before that moment, the internet was cut. The sequence tells its own story. The regime did not fear random unrest. It feared synchronization. It feared millions acting at the same time, seeing one another, realizing they were not alone. That is why the blackout came first. What followed revealed the scale of preparation. Reports and images showed security forces occupying school campuses, including Imam Ali High School, a location previously used during the 2022 protests after the death of Mahsa Amini. The same playbook is being reused. Schools sit inside residential areas close to streets where crowds form, allowing units to surge outward quickly. This is a tactic designed for speed and shock. In parallel, footage obtained by Iran International showed individuals in hazmat-style suits and protective masks positioned on vehicles marked with hazardous material warning symbols. Whether chemical agents are deployed or not, The symbolism alone is chilling. It signals readiness for escalation beyond conventional crowd control. As protests gained momentum, additional footage showed the use of shotguns against demonstrators and the deliberate separation of individuals from groups before they were beaten on camera. The imbalance is stark. On one side, organized units equipped with weapons, vehicles, and protective gear. On the other, civilians armed with little more than numbers and resolve. This contrast is not accidental. It is designed to intimidate and psychologically fragment crowds before physical force is applied. And yet, despite the blackout, despite the threats, despite visible preparation for violence, people still came out. Even under total digital isolation, clips continued to surface, likely transmitted through Starlink connections. Illegal but widespread enough to create pockets of visibility. The blackout failed to erase presence. It only made it harder to hide. Banners appeared declaring that the country cannot prosper under clerical rule. Acts of symbolic defiance spread, particularly among women, directly challenging the authority of the supreme leader. The regime tried to blind the country before 8 p.m. Instead, it revealed something far more dangerous to its survival: fear on one side and defiance on the other. What is unfolding beneath the blackout is not just a confrontation on the streets, but a fracture inside the state itself. While security forces are deployed outward, something quieter and more telling is happening inward. Reports suggest that senior officials and members of influential reformist families within the government are quietly preparing exit options. According to information circulated by a major French daily, families of high-ranking Iranian officials have recently sought visas to France, not as tourists but as contingencies. This includes figures connected to reformist circles who understand a brutal truth. When regimes feel threatened enough to cut off an entire nation's internet, they are also preparing for outcomes they can no longer control. Elites do not seek refuge when they believe stability is guaranteed. This silent preparation reveals a third layer of panic. The leadership may project strength on television, but behind closed doors, calculations about survival are underway. In authoritarian systems, this moment is critical. When insiders begin hedging against collapse, loyalty erodes quickly. Orders are still given, but belief in the system weakens. The result is a dangerous asymmetry: outward brutality paired with inward uncertainty. History shows that regimes rarely fall because crowds are brave alone. They fall when parts of the system stop believing the future belongs to them. Meanwhile, the state is attempting to buy time with a strategy bordering on desperation. A recent announcement from reformist-aligned figures proposed distributing roughly $7 per person per month to citizens as economic relief. The timing could not be more revealing. This was not a long-term policy shift. It was an emergency bribe offered as protests intensified. For many Iranians, it landed not as relief, but as an insult. In a country where inflation exceeds 40%, $7 spread across months does not address hardship. It highlights how detached the leadership has become from daily reality. The contrast becomes even sharper when placed against the regime's external spending. In the same year this offer was floated, the government reportedly transferred around $1 billion to Hezbollah. For protesters struggling to afford food, medicine, and rent, this disparity has become a rallying point. That is why chants have shifted decisively toward a single demand: focus on Iran. Neither Gaza nor Lebanon. My life for Iran is not just a slogan. It is a rejection of an entire governing philosophy that prioritizes ideological expansion over domestic survival. The economic backdrop explains why these protests refuse to fade. Iran's GDP contracted in 2025 while inflation surged beyond 40%, with similar levels projected for 2026. Unemployment is nearing 10%, and the national currency is in freefall. Iran exports oil but imports a large share of consumer goods. As the currency collapses, the cost of daily life explodes. Just months ago, $1 bought roughly 800,000 rials. Now it buys more than 1.4 million rials, turning anyone with foreign currency into a paper millionaire. As ordinary wages become meaningless, the collapse is no longer abstract. It shows up in empty shelves, delayed medicine, and shrinking meals. Official figures indicate that roughly 30% of Iranians now live below the poverty line, and the number is rising each month. This is not a temporary downturn. It is structural decay. Layered on top of economic collapse is a water crisis that many inside Iran openly describe as man-made. Years of mismanagement, dam projects, and misguided policies have drained rivers and reservoirs. Instead of acknowledging responsibility, officials blame foreign enemies for manipulating weather patterns in neighboring countries for diverting clouds. For a population facing empty taps and dry farmland, these explanations sound less like governance and more like fantasy. A state that cannot manage water, the most basic resource, struggles to claim legitimacy. Against this backdrop, the blackout takes on a deeper meaning. It is not only about suppressing protest footage, it is about buying time while contradictions pile up. A state that cannot stabilize its currency, cannot provide water, and cannot offer credible economic relief increasingly relies on force. That reliance accelerates decline. Security forces are visible everywhere now, but visibility cuts both ways. The more armored units occupy schools and streets, the clearer it becomes that the regime no longer trusts its own legitimacy. And yet, despite all this pressure, people continue to appear. The blackout did not empty the streets. It changed the rules of engagement. Protests are harder to coordinate, but also harder to fully suppress because they were driven by accumulated grievances rather than a single trigger. The regime can shut down networks, but it cannot shut down memory. Every prior crackdown, every broken promise, every economic shock feeds the current moment. This is why appeals are now being made directly to soldiers and police, urging them to lay down arms and refuse orders to fire on citizens. Such appeals only surface when protesters believe cracks already exist. The most dangerous phase for any authoritarian system is when it must choose between escalating violence and risking internal fracture. Iran is approaching that point now. The blackout, intimidation messages, conversion of schools into bases, and quiet exit plans of elites are not signs of control. They are symptoms of a system bracing for impact, uncertain whether it can survive what comes next. What makes this moment especially volatile is that the regime is facing pressure from multiple directions at once, and none of them are slowing down. On the streets, protests are no longer driven by a single incident, but by a convergence of failures built up over years. Economic collapse, environmental mismanagement, political repression, and a sense of national humiliation have merged into one continuous grievance. This is why the state's usual tactic of waiting for demonstrations to exhaust themselves is failing. People are not protesting because of one reversible decision. They are protesting because the system itself feels irreversible. When frustration reaches that level, time stops working in favor of the authorities. Inside the security apparatus, stress is equally visible. Maintaining nationwide deployments is expensive, exhausting, and psychologically corrosive. Soldiers and police are being asked to enforce blackout conditions, intimidate civilians, and prepare for violent confrontation while watching their own families suffer from inflation and shortages. This contradiction sits at the heart of the regime's survival strategy. The same economic collapse, pushing citizens into the streets, also erodes the morale of those ordered to suppress them. Loyalty enforced through fear lasts only as long as enforcers believe the system will protect them in the end. When that belief weakens, hesitation appears, and hesitation is fatal to authoritarian control. The Crown Prince's appeal directly targets this vulnerability. By framing the moment as a historical choice rather than a political demand, it shifts the question from obedience to legacy. Messages like this are dangerous for regimes because they introduce doubt into rigid hierarchies. They ask individuals in uniform to imagine a future beyond the current leadership and consider how their actions will be remembered when power changes hands. Authoritarian systems rely on the assumption that the future will resemble the present. When that assumption breaks, discipline begins to fray. Meanwhile, the regime's information strategy is showing signs of strain. State media continues to project calm and control, but the blackout itself undermines that message. If everything were under control, there would be no need to cut communication nationwide. Every citizen understands this instinctively. The act meant to project strength instead signals fear. Even those not participating in protests are forced to confront the realization that the leadership does not trust its own population with information. That realization alone shifts public psychology, turning passive dissatisfaction into quiet resentment. The continued appearance of footage despite the blackout further damages the regime's narrative. Each clip that escapes, each angle showing crowds still forming, becomes proof that control is incomplete. Authorities cannot fully seal the country, and people know it. This creates a feedback loop. The more the state tightens restrictions, the more symbolic acts of defiance multiply. Slogans sharpen, gestures grow bolder. Participation becomes not just protest, but an act of reclaiming agency in a system designed to strip it away. At the same time, economic signals continue to deteriorate. Currency volatility makes planning impossible for businesses and households alike. Prices change too fast for wages to keep up. Savings evaporate. For young people, the future feels closed. For older generations, the stability that once justified endurance has vanished. When both youth and elders see no credible path forward, unrest becomes a baseline condition rather than an exception. The water crisis compounds this sense of abandonment. In many regions, access to clean, reliable water has become unpredictable, affecting agriculture, industry, and daily life. Farmers lose crops, urban residents face rationing. Instead of addressing policy failures, officials deflect blame outward, invoking conspiracies about weather manipulation and foreign sabotage. These explanations may satisfy hardline supporters, but for those living with dry taps and dying fields, they deepen cynicism. A state that cannot manage water struggles to claim legitimacy. All of this converges on a single reality. The regime is running out of nonviolent tools. Economic concessions are too small to matter. Propaganda is losing credibility. Digital repression cannot fully contain physical presence. That leaves force as the primary remaining option. History suggests that at this stage, outcomes diverge sharply. Either repression succeeds temporarily at a high human cost, or the act of repression accelerates internal fractures that bring collapse sooner than expected. There is very little middle ground. The blackout is not the climax of the story, it is the threshold. What follows depends not only on the size of the crowds, but on decisions made inside barracks, command rooms, and government offices. Every order given and every order questioned now carries weight far beyond the moment. The streets are only one front. The real struggle is over belief, loyalty, and the future direction of the state. As the blackout tightened like a noose around the nation's communication, the response from the highest levels of power revealed a leadership not only under siege on the streets, but in psychological retreat. Supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, whose authority has long been the immovable center of Iran's revolutionary state, addressed the nation on state television. The address felt less like reassurance and more like defiance in the face of a crisis that even the clerical establishment did not fully control. He accused those in the streets of trying to destroy their own cities, to please the president of another country, tying internal dissent to external enemies in an attempt to delegitimize the movement. Analysts describe this not as strength, but as a last-ditch effort to coerce loyalty by inflaming nationalist sentiment at a time when it is rapidly diminishing inside Iran. Yet the imagery spilling out despite the blackout painted a starkly different picture. Fires raged in multiple cities. Buses, cars, and motorcycles burned. Scenes that from aerial footage looked less like routine protests and more like pockets of urban warfare. These images did not come from a muted crowd quietly asking for change. They came from a population that, after years of repression and economic suffering, had clearly crossed a threshold, transforming from isolated protesters into a self-sustaining movement confronting power head-on. Despite digital isolation, the scale of unrest was reported to be sweeping, extending beyond the capital into provincial cities and even rural towns, touching all 31 provinces of Iran. This nationwide spread echoed some of the largest demonstrations in decades, drawing in oil workers, students, bazaar merchants, and ordinary citizens who had never before taken to the streets in political defiance. International briefings repeatedly used phrases like "largest in years," underscoring how deeply initial economic grievances had evolved into broad political rejection. Behind the scenes, hard numbers tell a grim story. Local human rights activists reported that at least 42 protesters had been killed, and more than 2,000 detained since the early days of the demonstrations, far higher than earlier tallies that had already alarmed observers. What began with shopkeepers frustrated by soaring prices and a collapsing currency rapidly escalated into clashes marked by security forces opening fire and raiding hospitals to detain or intimidate those seeking refuge. And reports emerging from specific cities have fueled fears that even more horrific abuses may lie ahead. I hope you liked this video. We'll meet again with another one. Until then, take